Being a product of an era when Sega had a healthy stake in the markets for both arcade and home console hardware, Space Harrier has enjoyed a ton of ports to different machines. And for a good long time, Sega were keen to make sure the game was always available in some form on their major consoles, from the Master System right up through the Sega Saturn. You could even play it on the Dreamcast, after a fashion, in the widely acclaimed Shenmue, where it was a playable Easter egg. But things get particularly interesting when you look at how the game was represented on the Sega Mega Drive. Sega's sleek 16-bit bundle of blast processing is the only one of their consoles besides the Dreamcast that didn't get a dedicated standalone port of the game. Instead, early adopters of the console were offered Space Harrier 2 as a launch title, with no sign of the original game appearing on the system, at least not until the later release of Sega's 32X add-on, which would receive its own highly faithful recreation. Space Harrier is one of those games I feel I have personal history with. I first played it on the Atari ST my parents bought for me when I was about 12 years old, and I can still vividly remember the excitement I felt when I found it in the Power Pack Games bundle that came with it. I played that version of it to death, and it was actually one of the first video games I ever completed, which isn't surprising because, in hindsight, I probably spent more time playing it than was good for me. What really captivated me about the game, and more than likely explains why I was so preoccupied with it, were the weird and wonderful sights it showed me. I mean, how many other games put you in a jumpsuit, strap you to a giant cannon, and propel you through a checkerboard landscape filled with spaceships, stone heads, dragons, multicoloured mushrooms, and giant robots that look like they escaped from an episode of Mobile Suit Gundam? Visually, this game's an acid trip, and even though, truth be told, there really isn't a great deal to Space Harrier's gameplay, the sheer strangeness of everything it puts on screen and the way it's so vibrantly rendered taught me a valuable lesson back in the day. This was one of the first video games I played that made me think of them less as something to waste my afternoons with, and more as an art form. I once described it to somebody as being like the 80s video game adaptation of a Hollywood science fiction action movie directed by Salvador Dali, inspired by M.C. Escher. And I think that description still holds up. But looks are only skin deep. The real question here is, how does the 32X version of Space Harrier stack up as a conversion of the arcade game? And the answer is, pretty damned well. In fact, it's pretty much as accurate as you could possibly expect. The Space Harrier arcade machine is notable for three things. One is that you sit in it to play. Another is that it featured Sega's, for the time, impressive sprite scaling technology. And the final significant detail is that, in a rather forward-thinking move on Sega's part, it features a true analog joystick. All of these features posed some difficulties for early ports of the game. Inevitably, the feel of a sit-in cab can't be reproduced for a home conversion, but fortunately, the 32X hardware is well up to the task of recreating the scaling sprites of the arcade original. This is one of the most significant steps up in quality of home ports of the game, making the graphics handling appear smoother than any other prior conversion. It's certainly far superior to what was seen on Sega's own consoles up to that point. If you look at the Master System version of the game, or the Game Gear port that was derived from it, there's really no comparison. And even Space Harrier 2 on the Mega Drive, while it took a good stab at faking the Sega Superscaler effect, wasn't quite there. But here, Sega finally nailed the look of the game. Visually, it's smooth and looks completely authentic. It's only the analog control then that presents an issue this version of Space Harrier can't fully address. But you've got to be reasonable in your expectations here. We take analog sticks on game controllers for granted these days, but it's quite something to think that it wasn't until the mid to late 90s that they became an accepted part of the feature set for home consoles. Even the first generation Sony PlayStation didn't get thumbsticks on its controller right from the off, and predating even that, the 32X, being an add-on for the Mega Drive, had to make use of the base console's gamepad, which means that analog control is still off the table for this conversion. It's really not worth crying over though, because unless you've spent a lot of time playing the coin-op over any of its home conversions, you may never even notice the difference in how they handle, and this one is perfectly playable. Having smooth, responsive controls for a port of Space Harrier is kind of important, because it's a game that requires sharp reflexes at times. You don't want to feel like it's fighting against you, and it's the least you could ask for any conversion to get right, because, as I've already said, there's really not a whole lot to the game. You simply move your character around on screen to dodge ground level obstacles and enemy fire, and shoot back with any one of the buttons on the gamepad. That's as complex as it ever gets, besides working out how to beat its end of stage bosses, which in themselves can be mostly beaten by spamming them with shots over and over until they explode. The only time the basic gameplay formula gets changed up is during bonus stages, where your character will ride a flying dragon and denude the checkerboard landscape of its flora, which is a nice enough change of pace. But overall, this isn't a game to tax the brain. There are no power-ups and nothing as fancy as a discernible storyline, and it's never going to be remembered for its depth of gameplay. But all of that is fine, because Space Harrier is what it is, and if what you're after is a good fix of straight-ahead, technically impressive arcade-style blasting, it still hits the mark. It's the kind of game you'll play mostly to see how far you can get into it, and how high you can score, and, if you're anything like me, just to enjoy the whacked-out imagery it wants to show you. I'm quite conscious that I haven't spent much time in this review talking about how Space Harrier actually plays. That's because, to be honest, there's not much I can say about it. For all its fancy graphics, it's pretty simple as arcade shooters go. But to dispel any doubts, this 32X conversion is most certainly one of the very best you'll find, only bettered by those available for the Sega Saturn or found in the Mega Drive Classics collection on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, where an emulated version of the arcade game itself is an easily unlocked bonus feature. To be fair though, there's really not much in it to my eyes. Space Harrier was old enough by the time the 32X shipped to retail, and the performance gap between the arcade hardware and Sega's add-on box of tricks was narrow enough that I'm hard pressed to tell much difference without doing a considered side-by-side comparison. And on that basis, if you're a fan of the game, you can safely walk away from this review taking that as a huge and entirely warranted recommendation. Arcade accuracy is not to be sniffed at, and this conversion does the original justice in a way that few others before it came close to.